So the mayor and his cronies start to debate over whether or not to pay the ransom, while the employees of the subway take in the situation. And now for one of my favorite scenes of the movie with one of my favorite characters, Kaz Dolowitz. He's a boss at one of the subway stops, and he just gets so mad when he finds out these guys have taken a subway car. So after finding out about the situation, he charges down the tunnel right for the train. Mr. Gray sees this, points his gun at Kaz, and tells him to stop or he will shoot. Kaz isn't hearing any of it, however. He keeps right on charging, yelling, insulting, and anything else you can think of. It's his New York arrogance that makes this scene work. I know this sounds like an incredibly stupid thing to do, and really it is, but it's a combination of arrogance, stupidity, and anger that makes this scene work. I can actually see Kaz Dolowitz in his arrogance thinking that this guy just won't dare to shoot me. And that's pretty much what he's doing. He's daring Mr. Gray to shoot him. And Mr. Gray does. Now there's an important distinction to make here. Based off evidence I have seen in this movie, not been told so much as seen, I believe that Mr. Gray would not have been able to shoot Kaz, whereas Mr. Gray did not have that much of a problem doing it. I also believe Mr. Blue or Mr. Brown probably would have been willing to shoot Kaz. Not Mr. Green, though. They have shown us so far that this really isn't his life, and these just aren't the kind of things that he does. So Kaz is dead, and there's a little bit of a problem brewing between the four hijackers. You see, they weren't there for the shooting firsthand. They were near the back of the car, I guess. So they don't completely know what's going on. Now, we saw it. We know Mr. Gray, from his perspective, was in the right. He told the guy he's going to shoot if you don't stop walking, and he kept walking. He did what he needed to do from his perspective for the mission. But to them, they, who already suspect Mr. Gray of being a loose cannon of sorts, are not going to look at it like that. They may view it as unnecessary blood spilled thanks to Mr. Gray. This starts a process where Mr. Gray begins to have a falling out with the rest of the group. They look at him as a loose cannon, and we'll see this come to a head much later in the movie. But I'll talk about that more when it actually comes up. But this is where everything starts. We already know Mr. Blue didn't much care for Mr. Gray, and after this, I think the rest of the hijackers are going to be a little wary about him now that he's spilled first blood. The subway employees kinda sorta grieve over the death of Kaz, as some of them knew him pretty well. Meanwhile, at the mayor's house, the sick mayor is being counseled by his cronies over whether or not to pay the ransom. He's pretty much undecided, and then his wife steps in and convinces him to pay the money. Through this scene, we see the mayor comment that New York just doesn't have $1 million, which sounds laughable today, and maybe even back then. However, I did some research, and it seems that New York was indeed in some financial distress during this time period. This movie was made in 1974, so I looked back a little bit, and found that New York probably would have been strapped for cash around this time. So maybe that explains why the hijackers aren't asking for a gigantic sum of money. They know they would never get it in these economic times. It's a pretty minor thing to actually talk about, but I kind of appreciated how they did discuss why the hijackers might not be asking for that much money. So it is radioed to Mr. Blue that his demands will be met. However, Mr. Blue continues to insist that the time schedule be stuck to, and claims that they have only 49 minutes to deliver this money. This is met with some disdain by Lieutenant Garber, who believes the clock should be turned off since now they're paying up. Mr. Blue, however, is insistent that the hour deadline be met by the second, or hostages will die. So we see some short scenes of people stacking money, counting money, arranging money, and everything else. I suppose in the 70s this was a rather difficult task, as we see these people working as fast as humanly possible, trying to organize all this money and get it together in time. Interspersed with all this is scenes of the operator trying to still run the subway in spite of the situation. It's actually pretty funny. He runs around yelling at people, trying to get the subway back on its feet, all while most everyone else is dealing with the ransom situation. He's actually shocked and appalled when he learns that they're going to pay the money, and seems more interested in getting the subway started than in the well-being of the passengers on the train. He's also appalled by the fact that Lieutenant Garber is constantly on the phone with Mr. Blue asking for more time, which Mr. Blue is refusing to grant. 15 minutes, 10 more minutes, Mr. Blue doesn't care. As far as he's concerned, either they show up on time or hostages die. This creates a nice, tense situation because as this procedure goes along, we see quite clearly that there is just no way in hell they're going to be able to get the money down to the train before the hour deadline is up. All the while, the subway employees are wondering just how these guys are planning to escape. After all, they are pretty much buried underground with concrete walls on all sides. All the while, inside the train, we see minor incidents building up with Mr. Gray. He punches the pimp in the mouth, he tries to semi-hit on the hooker, and all these other little nasty things, and we kind of get an idea of where this is going. Finally, in a scene that really bothers me for reasons I'll get into in 1 second here, Mr. Blue grants Garber's request for more time, just in a slightly unconventional way. Now, instead of the hour deadline being for delivering the money to the train, it is now getting the money to the station that's closest to the train. First off, there's really no difference between granting 5 extra minutes of time and granting this request, because ultimately it's going to mean the same thing. They're going to beat the deadline, get to the station just in time, and then it'll take about 5 minutes for them to get the money to the train. What's the difference between granting 5 extra minutes and changing the location of the deadline? It really doesn't make much sense. Second of all, between these two, Mr. Blue would agree to the 5-minute deal before he would the changing of the location deal, because he's actually on the train. He's not at the station, nor is anybody who is working for him. He can't see what's going on at the train station. He doesn't have anyone stationed there. He doesn't know if they're there or not. A fact that will be exploited very shortly. So why he agreed to something that he cannot actually see, I don't know. Regardless, it looks like the police car with the money in it might get to the location just in time, but an accident causes the car to flip over. This costs them precious minutes as the money is handed off to a policeman on a motorcycle who completes the journey. This incident makes it completely impossible for them to get to the station within the hour deadline. So Mr. Garber does exactly what I said they should do a minute ago. They call in, tell Mr. Blue that the money is at the station, and there's no way Mr. Blue is going to know that they're not there yet. He doesn't have anyone there. So, all is well, and no hostages are dead. Quick aside, there's some underrated humor going on in this movie. It's not a part of any major plot point, but it's there, and I enjoy it. For instance, the subway employees know that there is an undercover cop on board the train, and they're wondering why hasn't he sprung into action yet. They begin to develop the theory that the cop is a female cop and would thus be incapable of doing anything as far as they're concerned. So we get a lot of wisecracks and sexist jokes and stuff. You know, the kind of things you might not see in today's movies, but you could easily get away with back in the 70s. Also, on either side of the tunnel, there's basically an army waiting to march in should they get the command. They're just hiding there with their snipers and their assault rifles, waiting for something to happen. A cop ends up getting stuck between the two, so he's forced to hide behind a pillar the whole time. He can't show himself to the train because they'll think the cops are trying to make a move and kill hostages, and he's afraid to show himself to the SWAT teams because he's afraid they'll think he's one of the hijackers and he'll get shot. So he's stuck there talking very quietly on the radio to Jerry Stiller's character, trying to explain the situation and occasionally cracking some pretty good jokes. It's the undercover humor in this movie that really made it work, in my opinion. Very appreciated.